You're about to step quietly into the world of the Victorians, a time when mornings began not with a phone alarm, but with the sound of horse hooves, coughing chimneys, and someone shouting about cabbages 3 streets away. Welcome to Sleepy, Boring, and Historic. I'm Stella, your mildly enthusiastic narrator for this gentle stroll through Victorian morning routines, a topic so thrillingly ordinary, it might just be the perfect bedtime story. Chapter 1. Imagine London around 1850. The sun is barely awake, and neither is anyone else. But unlike us, the Victorians didn't have the luxury of a snooze button. They had coal fires to light, chamber pots to empty, and 17 layers of clothing to wrestle with before breakfast. For the working classes, the day started long before dawn. Factory whistles replaced alarm clocks. The streets filled with chimney sweeps, milkmaids, and labourers trudging through the mist. The upper classes, of course, rose later, usually around 8 or 9, after their servants had already been awake for hours, coaxing the fires back to life and preparing breakfast trays with military precision. For the poor, mornings were a slow scramble for survival. Families often shared one cramped room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and dining space all at once. There was no running water, no bathroom, and definitely no luxury of privacy. Water had to be fetched from a shared street pump, and heating it required both time and coal, which many couldn't afford. A quick splash of cold water on the face counted as washing up, and that was that. Breakfast was basic, a crust of bread dipped in weak tea, or porridge made from yesterday's leftovers. Some families couldn't even afford that. Children were sent out early to sell matches or polish boots, while parents made their way to factories or workhouses. The smell of smoke, sweat, and damp wool filled the streets long before sunrise. Meanwhile, across town, the wealthy were having a far more comfortable start. In grand houses, the morning began not with clatter but with quiet. Servants moved like ghosts, lighting fires, drawing curtains, and setting tea trays by the bedside. Ladies and gentlemen awoke to warmth and order. For them, mornings were less about survival and more about ceremony. A lady might ring for her maid, because lifting her own teacup was simply too much before 9. A gentleman would read the newspaper while being shaved, perhaps offering a thoughtful nod about something happening in Parliament, though he'd never go near Parliament himself. Breakfast might include eggs, kippers, toast, and marmalade, all served by people who'd already been up since before dawn. Downstairs, the household staff were already deep in chaos. The cook wrestled with the new gas stove that burned everything but what she wanted. The scullery maid stood knee-deep in dishwater, and the butler glided about ensuring the silver gleamed enough to impress visitors who weren't even coming that day. This contrast, between the wealthy sipping tea upstairs and the workers scrubbing floors below, summed up the Victorian idea of order. Everyone had a place, and that place was rarely questioned. Mornings reflected the same principle. For the rich, the day was a calm display of refinement. For the poor, it was sheer endurance disguised as routine. And then there was tea. The great equalizer. If there's one thing all Victorians agreed on, it was that no day should begin without it. For the poor, the same leaves might be reused twice, or even 3 times. For the rich, tea came from fine caddies imported from India or Ceylon, brewed in gleaming silver pots. But regardless of class, the ritual was the same: tea before anything. It was the Victorian version of saying, "I can't function without caffeine." Personal grooming was another story entirely. A man might shave using a straight razor and a mirror so small he could barely see whether he'd removed his whiskers or his sideburns. A woman's beauty routine involved hair oil, powder, and occasionally poisonous lotions designed to make the skin appear fashionably pale. Health and safety hadn't quite been invented yet. Hair, however, was serious business. Women brushed and pinned theirs into elaborate creations that could survive small hurricanes. Men slicked theirs down with pomade until they gleamed like polished furniture. And then came the clothes. So many layers of them. For women, corsets, petticoats, skirts, and bustles, each one a minor engineering project. Dressing required both patience and core strength. For men, stiff collars, waistcoats, and trousers so high-waisted they could nearly be mistaken for body armor. Comfort wasn't fashionable. Decency was. Looking proper mattered more than breathing properly. Once everyone was laced, buttoned, brushed, and powdered, the day could truly begin. Servants disappeared into their duties, workers headed for their long shifts, and the well-to-do might take a morning stroll, or as they called it, a constitutional, purely to demonstrate good health. The streets were thick with fog and soot. Horses clattered by. Market stalls opened, selling everything from bread rolls to boot polish. Schoolchildren hurried along in stiff uniforms, while the smell of smoke drifted from every chimney like a national perfume. It was noisy, crowded, and chaotic, yet somehow, there was a sense of rhythm to it all. The Victorian morning was a picture of structure. Everyone, no matter their position, had a role to play. The working class endured the grind, the middle class pretended everything was fine, and the upper class congratulated themselves on being born at the top. Beneath it all ran that same quiet belief that life was meant to be orderly, even if it was terribly exhausting. And so the day would begin again. From the grandest townhouse to the narrowest alley, fires were lit, tea was poured, and another day of striving, surviving, and pretending commenced. When you think about it, it's oddly comforting. A whole society starting the day together, divided by class but united by tea and tiredness. So, as you sip your modern coffee and perhaps feel mildly annoyed about your alarm clock, spare a moment for the Victorians, who woke up before dawn, washed in cold water, dressed in armor disguised as clothing, and still managed to be punctual. Chapter 2. We're about to explore Victorian clothing and fashion, a world of elegance, discomfort, and enough fabric to reupholster an entire sitting room. Let's start with this simple truth: no one in the Victorian era dressed casually. The very idea of comfort was suspicious. If you looked relaxed, people assumed you were either ill, immoral, or possibly both. Clothes weren't just about warmth or modesty, they were social armor. Every layer told the world exactly who you were, and more importantly, who you weren't. For women, getting dressed was not an act, it was an ordeal. The day began with a layer known as the chemise, a sort of shapeless undershirt designed to protect the corset from sweat. Then came the drawers, stockings, petticoats, and finally, the corset, that formidable contraption of whalebone and willpower. Tight enough to rearrange internal organs, it was considered essential for maintaining the correct posture and the illusion that one's ribcage could politely disappear. The average corset could take 5 minutes to lace up, but only with help. No respectable lady dressed alone, that was what maids were for. Pulling, tightening, and occasionally pausing to let someone breathe were all part of the process. The end result? A tiny waist, a rigid back, and an overwhelming desire to faint at social events. Over the corset came more layers, petticoats to create volume, crinolines made of steel hoops to create even more volume, and skirts so wide they could knock over furniture. Imagine trying to fit through a doorway sideways, gracefully, of course. That was daily life for Victorian women. But fashion, in all its madness, was about status. The more impractical your outfit, the more respect you commanded. Because clearly, if you could afford to wear something that prevented movement or breathing, you didn't need to work. The upper classes wore delicate silks, lace, and brocade that couldn't survive a single drizzle. The poor wore wool, cotton, and hope, fabrics that could endure anything except another week of laundry. Speaking of laundry, let's take a moment to appreciate the unsung heroes of fashion, the washerwomen. Laundry was not a chore in Victorian Britain, it was a full-contact sport. Water had to be fetched and boiled by hand, soap was harsh enough to remove fingerprints, and wringing out garments required biceps of steel. White clothing was a sign of status, not just because it looked elegant, but because only the wealthy could afford to keep it clean. Men, on the other hand, had a simpler routine, but not by much. The Victorian gentleman was a creature of habit, starch, and occasional pomade. His morning began with layers too: long underwear, shirt, waistcoat, trousers, coat, and cravat. Every item had a rule. Shirt collars had to be high enough to make swallowing slightly inconvenient. Waistcoats had to match the social hour, darker for day, lighter for evening. And the hat? Absolutely essential. A man without a hat was considered half-dressed, if not entirely suspicious. Top hats were the crown of the well-dressed gentleman, tall, shiny, and often uncomfortable. They were made from silk, beaver felt, or whatever material could best survive British weather and the judgment of one's peers. Middle-class men might wear bowler hats, which were shorter and sturdier, the fashion equivalent of saying, "I work for a living, but still own a mirror." For working-class men, practicality won out over polish. Trousers were coarse, shirts were simple, and boots were meant to last. But even among the poor, there was pride in presentation. A clean collar or a well-mended sleeve could mean the difference between respect and ridicule. Appearances mattered deeply, even when money didn't. And yet, for all the discomfort and expense, fashion was also self-expression, in the most repressed way possible. Every stitch, color, and shape reflected the era's obsession with respectability. Women's silhouettes expanded like inverted balloons throughout the mid-1800s, then narrowed again toward the end of the century as new inventions, like the sewing machine, made fitted clothing more accessible. Skirts slimmed down, corsets loosened slightly, and people began to breathe again. Progress. Of course, as the century marched on, fashion slowly began to shift. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change factories, it changed wardrobes. Mass production made clothes cheaper, dyes brighter, and fashion trends faster. Department stores appeared, allowing women to browse for fabrics and accessories in ways their grandmothers could never imagine. Imagine the thrill of a world where you could buy a hat instead of make one. Revolutionary. But there was still a dark side to all this beauty. Many Victorian garments were dyed with chemicals that contained arsenic or lead. A bright green dress, for example, might make you look stunning, and slightly poisoned. Fabric dyes could cause rashes, fainting, or worse. It was fashion at its most fatal. Still, people wore it proudly, because looking respectable was worth the occasional bout of dizziness. Even under all that danger, people found small joys in fashion. Accessories were everything. Gloves, fans, brooches, and walking canes spoke volumes about taste and class. A lady's parasol wasn't just to block the sun, it was a symbol of refinement. A gentleman's pocket watch wasn't just for timekeeping, it announced that he had time to keep, and while we might roll our eyes today at the absurdity of corsets and top hats, it's worth remembering that fashion, for Victorians, was identity. It wasn't vanity, it was belonging. Every stitch was a statement of who you were, or who you wanted the world to think you were. Even the poorest workers took pride in looking proper, because respectability was the currency of the age. As the day drew on, people carried themselves through society wrapped in layer upon layer of expectation. Servants in uniform, laborers in patched shirts, clerks in pressed suits, all bound by the same invisible rule: look respectable, no matter how exhausted you are. By evening, when the rich changed into dinner attire and the poor collapsed into bed still half-dressed, the cycle would reset for another day. Clothes came off, corsets were unhooked with a sigh of relief, boots were polished for tomorrow, and everything returned to its proper place. It's strange, really, how much effort went into appearing effortless. To be seen as decent, you had to endure discomfort. To be seen as elegant, you had to suffer. Yet, beneath all that lace and starch, the Victorians were much like us, trying to fit into a world that demanded more than comfort ever could. Chapter 3. The rich dined like royalty, the poor scraped by on crumbs, and everyone, regardless of class, seemed determined to boil absolutely everything. Now, food tells you a lot about a society, and in Victorian Britain, it told you exactly where you stood on the social ladder. At the very top, breakfast began with silver trays, servants in silence, and enough courses to feed a small village. At the bottom, breakfast was tea without milk, bread without butter, and sometimes, if the week had gone well, a hint of dripping for flavor. Let's start with the upper crust, quite literally, the people who could afford the best crusts. The day for wealthy Victorians began with tea, toast, and something called kedgeree, a brave attempt at breakfast made from rice, fish, and hard-boiled eggs. Nothing quite says good morning like cold fish before 8 a.m. For those with an adventurous palate, there were also cuppas, porridge, and a steady flow of more tea than hydration science would recommend. Lunch, or luncheon if you wanted to sound fancy, might include cold meats, pies, or soup, served with an elegance that suggested no one ever spilled anything, though we all know they did. By evening, the main event arrived, dinner. And dinner was serious business. For the upper classes, dinner wasn't just about eating, it was performance art. Multiple courses, precise timing, and servants gliding about like ghosts with better posture. The menu could include roast beef, mutton, or venison, followed by game birds, vegetables boiled into submission, and puddings dense enough to stop a door. And puddings weren't always sweet, a confusing discovery for modern minds. Yorkshire pudding, for example, wasn't dessert at all but a savoury batter served with meat. Actual desserts, like treacle tart or spotted dick, came later, often drowning in custard. The Victorians had a knack for naming food in ways that sound either endearing or deeply unappetizing, depending on how hungry you are. Meanwhile, the middle classes were climbing the culinary ladder, trying their best to imitate aristocratic tastes, on a budget. Cookbooks became incredibly popular, promising to make any modest meal seem grand. Authors like Mrs. Beeton became household names, writing long, bossy instructions that made even toast sound like a test of character. A proper middle-class dinner might include roast chicken, potatoes, and a pudding for good measure. Aspiration was served with every course. Even families of modest means tried to make mealtimes look respectable. A clean tablecloth, matching plates, and a teaspoon of sugar in one's tea could make all the difference in appearing refined. Now, down at the other end of society, the story changes entirely. Working-class families often survived on bread, potatoes, and tea, sometimes all at once. Meat was a luxury, eggs a treat, and vegetables came mostly in the form of cabbage, which could be stretched to feed everyone and didn't require much seasoning, since no one had any. Street food became a lifeline for many. Sellers roamed the smoky streets of London with trays of baked potatoes, eels, and pies of uncertain origin. There were also whelk stalls, where the adventurers could enjoy chewy seafood on the go. It wasn't glamorous, but it was filling. And warm food on a cold London night meant everything. In poorer homes, kitchens were often nothing more than a small hearth and a single pot. That's why boiling was the universal solution. It was simple, safe, and economical. Soups and stews ruled the day. A good broth could feed a family for days, especially if you kept adding water. Leftovers weren't thrown away, they were reimagined as something new, which is a polite way of saying the same thing again, just wetter. Tea, of course, was the great equalizer. Everyone drank it, rich or poor, north or south. It was hot, comforting, and gave the illusion that life was slightly better than it was. Even if the leaves had been reused 3 times, a steaming cup could lift morale faster than a sermon. Sugar was precious, and milk was optional, but tea was sacred. As the Industrial Revolution rolled on, cities filled with workers, and diet became a matter of survival. In factories and mines, meals were quick, basic, and eaten on the move. Bread and cheese, a slice of cold pie, or even just a mug of weak tea were enough to keep people going until the next whistle blew. In contrast, the wealthy continued their ritual of grand dining. They had servants to serve, cooks to cook, and often more food than they could eat. Some families even had display meals, dishes laid out purely for decoration during parties, never touched, just admired. It was a delicious kind of absurdity. Food was deeply tied to identity. To eat well meant to live well. To eat poorly meant to be invisible. Yet even in poverty, there was dignity. Families gathered around shared meals, however simple. A piece of bread split among many still meant togetherness, and we mustn't forget the rise of the Victorian cook, mostly women, often overworked, occasionally terrifying. These domestic geniuses kept the engines of daily life running. They roasted, boiled, and baked for hours on end, armed with little more than instinct and soot-stained aprons. Recipes were guidelines, not rules. Measurements included vague suggestions like a good lump of butter or a teacup of flour. And somehow, dinner still appeared on the table. Food trends also began to change as Britain's empire expanded. Exotic ingredients, spices, tea, sugar, and even curry powder trickled in from abroad. The Victorians developed a taste for the unfamiliar, though they often ruined it by overcooking everything. Still, the global pantry grew, setting the stage for the modern British love of variety, even if it came with questionable fusion dishes. By late evening, after all the soups, pies, and puddings had been cleared away, Victorians often indulged in supper. For the wealthy, that might mean oysters or trifle. For the poor, it might simply mean whatever crumbs were left. Either way, it was the quiet end to a long, hungry day. Looking back, it's hard not to marvel at the sheer determination of the human stomach in the 19th century. The Victorians worked hard, dined harder, and seasoned everything with equal parts pride and soot. They invented food rituals that defined class, manners, and aspiration, and yet, no matter how high or low they stood, everyone shared the same instinct: to gather, to eat, and to make the most of what they had. So next time you sit there with your modern snacks and microwave meals, give a little nod of thanks to your Victorian ancestors. They walked so we could have takeaways. They boiled cabbage so we could have curry. They fainted over hot soup so we could scroll while eating pizza in bed. Chapter 4. From the cramped chaos of working-class slums to the polished calm of upper-class townhouses. Both called it home, though that's about where the similarities ended. Let's begin, as most things in history do, with a matter of location. If you were wealthy, you lived in a townhouse with high ceilings, polished brass, and enough servants to keep your carpets from ever knowing the touch of a muddy boot. If you were poor, you lived in a crowded slum, a place so small, even the rats had to book in advance. In the grand homes of London, the front doors gleamed, the steps were scrubbed daily, and windows shone with pride. Inside, rooms flowed elegantly from drawing rooms to dining rooms to morning rooms, because apparently one room per activity simply wasn't enough. The air smelled faintly of furniture polish, perfume, and whatever was roasting downstairs. The upper classes believed in order, everything had a place, and every person had a purpose. Servants kept the machinery of the household running, quietly and invisibly. There were cooks, maids, butlers, nannies, and coachmen, all performing their roles with precision. A good servant was one who was never seen, like a ghost with better timing. The family of the house floated through life on the fruits of that labor. Breakfast appeared as if by magic. Fires were already lit. Beds were made without a sound. Clean linen arrived daily, and somehow, laundry just vanished. Of course, the illusion of calm came at a price, both financial and human. The comfort of the few was built on the exhaustion of the many. Now, down the hill and into the heart of the industrial cities, things looked quite different. The working-class home was a world of noise, soot, and survival. Whole families squeezed into a single room, sometimes sharing walls thin enough to hear your neighbor sneeze, and sometimes, unfortunately, smell it too. Most slum housing was built quickly, cheaply, and with minimal care for ventilation or light. Narrow streets packed with tiny brick houses stretched endlessly. Water had to be fetched from a pump down the street, and if you wanted a bath, you boiled water in a tin tub and hoped no one used it before you. Shared toilets, called privies, stood in backyards, often shared by multiple families. Hygiene was less a daily routine and more an optimistic concept. The smell was, well, let's just say memorable. And when the weather turned cold, families huddled together around small coal fires that smoked as much as they warmed. Despite it all, there was pride in these homes. Mothers scrubbed floors, hung out washing, and kept order as best they could. A clean doorstep meant respect, a flower in the window meant hope. Working-class families might not have had servants or parlors, but they had resilience, and that was its own kind of luxury. Now, let's wander back up to the townhouse, carefully. We wouldn't want to dirty the marble floors. Here, every detail mattered. Wallpaper matched curtains, which matched cushions, which matched the carefully curated impression of wealth. Drawing rooms were filled with ornaments, porcelain figurines, framed family portraits, and clocks that chimed at socially appropriate intervals. The furniture was heavy and ornate, as if competing in a silent contest of who could own the most mahogany. Even chairs looked intimidating, designed less for comfort and more for posture. Sitting properly was an art form, and slouching was practically a crime. The lady of the house spent her days supervising servants, planning menus, writing letters, and occasionally fainting in drawing rooms, a sort of genteel cardio. The master of the house often worked in business or politics, returning home to smoke cigars in the study and read newspapers by lamplight. Children were mostly seen in the nursery, raised by nannies until they were deemed presentable for guests. In contrast, the working-class home was everyone's space, all at once. The same room might serve as kitchen, dining room, and bedroom. Privacy was rare, and peace was rarer still. Children ran in and out, adults worked long hours, and life revolved around the fire, if there was enough coal to light it. Many homes were damp, overcrowded, and poorly ventilated, leading to constant illness. The smell of damp walls mixed with that of boiling cabbage and coal smoke. Yet amid the struggle, community thrived. Neighbors helped one another. If someone fell ill, others shared food. If rent was due, people pooled pennies. The poor survived not through comfort, but through kindness. Back in the grand homes, the separation between family and servants was strict. Servants lived in the basement or attic, connected by narrow staircases that allowed them to appear and disappear like polite phantoms. The downstairs world had its own hierarchy: the cook ruled the kitchen, the butler ruled the pantry, and the rest did as they were told. The sounds of clattering pots and whispered gossip echoed below, while upstairs the family discussed poetry and politics, blissfully unaware of the real work happening beneath their feet. It was a society within a society, both under one roof. Lighting, too, told its own story. The rich had chandeliers and oil lamps that glowed warmly over their dinners. The poor had candles, or if things were tight, the dim flicker of the fireplace. At night, the difference between luxury and survival was measured in light. And yet, despite the divide, the Victorians shared one thing: an obsession with propriety. Cleanliness, manners, and respectability were ideals that crossed class lines. Even the poorest mothers scrubbed their doorsteps to show they cared about decency. Respectability was the currency of hope. By the late 1800s, reformers began to take notice. Writers and social campaigners exposed the harsh realities of slum life: overcrowding, disease, and despair. Slowly, awareness grew, leading to housing reforms and better sanitation. The idea that every person deserved a decent home began to take root, though real change would take decades. Meanwhile, in the drawing rooms of the upper classes, the gas lamps flickered, music played, and tea was served in fine china. Conversation drifted to politics, poetry, or possibly the scandal of someone's daughter eloping. Life was comfortable, but not without its own pressures. Appearances had to be maintained at all costs. The walls of a Victorian home, whether brick or marble, contained stories of pride, struggle, and survival. Beneath the elegance and the grime, both rich and poor were united by the same simple truth: everyone just wanted a bit of warmth, a full belly, and peace at the end of the day. So next time you look around your home, whether it's big or small, neat or chaotic, spare a thought for the Victorians. They paved the way for plumbing, heating, and the ability to complain about rent online. Chapter 5. Let's begin with a thought. If you were alive in the 19th century, your life probably revolved around work. Not passion, not purpose, just survival. From dawn till dusk, Britain buzzed, clanked, coughed, and occasionally exploded its way through the Industrial Revolution. Factories rose like great iron beasts, their chimneys belching smoke that turned skies grey and lungs black. The sound of machinery was constant, rhythmic, deafening, and oddly hypnotic. For many, it was the soundtrack of life. At the top of the working pyramid sat the factory owners, merchants, and industrialists, the new Victorian elite. They built fortunes on cotton, coal, steel, and the unwavering effort of millions. Below them were managers and overseers, watching over workers with clipboards and questionable moustaches. And below them, well, almost everyone else. Let's start with one of the smallest and most infamous Victorian workers, the chimney sweep. Usually a boy, sometimes as young as 6. Hired for his size, not his skill, he climbed narrow, soot-filled chimneys armed with brushes, bravery, and a concerning lack of common sense from the adults supervising. The work was brutal and dangerous. The air inside the flue was suffocating, the soot burned the skin, and getting stuck was a very real possibility. Accidents were common. So were lifelong injuries. Yet for many poor families, sending a child to sweep was a way to earn food or rent. Childhood, as we know it, was considered a luxury item. Factories weren't much better. Across Britain, textile mills, match factories, and ironworks thrummed with endless activity. Men, women, and children worked side by side in hot, noisy rooms, surrounded by machines that didn't particularly care about human fingers. Hours were long, 12 to 16 a day, 6 days a week. Sundays were for church, exhaustion, or both. In textile mills, young girls called mill lasses tended to spinning machines for pennies a week. The air was thick with cotton dust, which made breathing difficult and diseases plentiful. In match factories, workers handled phosphorus, which glowed beautifully and caused phossy jaw, a charming condition where your jawbone slowly disintegrated. Safety wasn't really a concept yet. Miners, meanwhile, spent their days underground, digging coal, hauling carts, and occasionally wondering what sunlight looked like. Accidents were frequent: cave-ins, explosions, and gas leaks. Yet mining towns thrived on camaraderie. When disaster struck, whole communities rallied together, bound by the unspoken truth that they were all, quite literally, in it together. For women, work came with its own challenges. Many worked in factories or as domestic servants in wealthy households. Servants' days began before sunrise and ended long after sunset. Their duties ranged from scrubbing floors to ironing, cooking, and caring for children who weren't theirs. Privacy was non-existent, wages were low, and yet domestic service was considered a respectable job, far better than the uncertain life of the street. And yes, the streets had their own economy. Hawkers, flower sellers, and bootblacks worked the pavements of London and other cities. Street vendors shouted the day's offerings: hot pies, penny a slice, filling the air with the sounds of survival. Others collected bones, rags, or even dog droppings to sell for reuse in industries. In Victorian Britain, nothing was wasted, not even dignity. Still, not everyone toiled endlessly. The middle classes worked in offices, shops, or as clerks, the growing army of pen pushers and ledger fillers that kept the empire's paperwork moving. Their hands were clean, their collars starched, and their complaints plentiful. They were the respectable face of modern employment, proof that one could earn a living without coal under the fingernails. The rich, of course, didn't work in the same sense. Their time was spent managing estates, attending meetings, or dabbling in business ventures, ideally from a distance. Hard work was admired in theory, but only when performed by someone else. The Victorian idea of success was to rise high enough that your hands no longer looked useful. But as the century rolled on, reform began to stir. Campaigners, writers, and politicians started to notice that children shouldn't be climbing chimneys before breakfast. The Factory Act slowly introduced limits, reducing working hours, banning the employment of very young children, and insisting on some basic safety measures. It was progress, slow and imperfect, but progress nonetheless. Unions began to form too, giving workers a voice, often shouted hoarsely through clouds of smoke and injustice. Strikes, marches, and petitions became tools for change. The working class, once silent, began to demand fair pay, shorter hours, and the radical notion of not dying on the job. Even so, poverty remained the shadow beneath the empire's shining surface. Workhouses loomed as grim reminders of what awaited those who couldn't find employment. These institutions were meant to help the poor, but often felt more like punishment. Families were separated, conditions were harsh, and food was deliberately unappealing, the idea being that no one should ever find poverty too comfortable. And yet, despite it all, people found moments of pride in their labor. A factory worker took pride in precision. A miner took pride in endurance. A housemaid took pride in a spotless floor. There was dignity in doing what had to be done, even when no one thanked you for it. By the late Victorian era, machines had transformed Britain, and so had the people who ran them. New jobs emerged: railway workers, telegraph operators, and shop assistants. Work was changing, and with it, the dream that one day, life might be easier for the next generation. Looking back, it's hard not to admire their strength. They worked through soot, sweat, and endless noise. They built cities, railways, and industries that shaped the modern world. And while we might sit at desks today complaining about Wi-Fi and deadlines, the Victorians would probably look at us, sip their weak tea, and mutter something about luxury. Chapter sucks. Let's begin in a Britain that was growing faster than its ability to teach anyone anything. The Victorian era brought progress, invention, and industry, but when it came to education, it was more of a patchwork quilt than a system. Who got educated, what they learned, and whether they could afford to sit still long enough all depended on one simple thing: class. If you were rich, education was an art form. Wealthy boys went to boarding schools, great echoing places like Eton, Harrow, and Rugby, where they studied Latin, Greek, mathematics, and how to look important in a hat. The timetable was strict, the punishments inventive, and the sports vigorous enough to break a limb before lunchtime. Discipline was everything. Talking in class earned you a caning. Failing to bow correctly might result in another. Even sneezing too loudly could attract unwanted educational attention. But for the upper class, it was all part of character building. And by character building, they mostly meant learning to keep a stiff upper lip while someone yells in Latin. Girls from wealthy families, meanwhile, were usually educated at home by governesses. They learned languages, embroidery, music, and the subtle art of fainting gracefully. Their curriculum was less about algebra and more about appearing cultured enough to marry a man who could afford algebra tutors for their children. For the middle classes, clerks, shopkeepers, and small business owners, private schools and church schools were the main options. Lessons were often crowded, teachers underpaid, and equipment limited to one blackboard, a stick of chalk, and a teacher's glare powerful enough to silence a city. But the working class, that's where education took a very different turn. Many children simply didn't go to school at all. They worked in factories, mines, or on the streets, because every penny mattered. The idea of education was lovely in theory, but not much help when you needed bread on the table. By the mid-1800s, reformers began to notice that an entire generation was growing up unable to read signs, write their names, or add up wages. So, the ragged schools were born, free schools for poor children, often run by churches or charities. The name came from the pupils themselves, who arrived in tattered clothes, bare feet, and endless curiosity. Ragged schools were basic, but they were a lifeline. A simple classroom, a handful of slates, and teachers with patience measured in miracles. They taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, the 3 R's, though technically only one of them actually started with R. They also taught manners, hygiene, and morality, which mostly involved long talks about not stealing apples. One of the champions of this movement was Thomas Guthrie in Scotland, and later, Lord Shaftesbury in England, both determined to give poor children a chance to learn, and maybe, just maybe, escape the factory floor. But Victorian education wasn't just about noble causes. It was also about control. Schools drilled discipline, obedience, and punctuality, the qualities employers loved. It wasn't enough to be clever, you had to be respectably clever. The goal wasn't personal freedom, it was fitting neatly into the machine of society. Let's not forget Sunday schools. These started as places for working children to learn on their only day off. They mixed Bible study with basic literacy. A child might spend 6 days shoveling coal, then on Sunday, learn how to spell the word coal. It wasn't exactly a rest day, but it was better than nothing. The big turning point came in 1870, with the Elementary Education Act, the first step toward making schooling compulsory. It didn't happen overnight, but it marked the beginning of free education for all children, regardless of class. By the end of the century, every child under 12 was expected to attend school. Truant officers, nicknamed the Education Police, roamed the streets looking for absentees, who usually hid behind lampposts with impressive skill. As schooling became more common, new subjects appeared: geography, history, science, and even art. Classrooms filled with maps of the British Empire, which teachers pointed at proudly while explaining that Britain ruled a quarter of the world. Children nodded along, though most of them couldn't find their own town on the map. Still, school life was hard. Teachers were strict, lessons dull, and equipment scarce. Pupils wrote with slate pencils, dipped pens in ink that spilled everywhere, and endured endless repetition. The cane hung behind the teacher's desk like a warning from God. And yet, for many, this tiny, chalky world was their first glimpse of possibility. In poorer areas, schools also provided warmth, food, and structure, things missing from home. A single book could be shared by a whole class. Songs and recitations made learning feel like play. And for children used to chaos, the sound of a bell marking the start and end of the day was strangely comforting. For the upper class, education continued to open doors to universities like Oxford and Cambridge, where gowns, Latin mottos, and endless tea breaks defined the experience. The middle class aimed for grammar schools, hoping to rise in society. And the working class slowly began to dream beyond the factory gates, a revolution of hope written in chalk dust and determination. Of course, not everyone approved. Some employers grumbled that education made children too clever for their own good. Others feared it might encourage them to ask awkward questions, like why are we working 16 hours for a shilling? But the tide of literacy couldn't be stopped. Once people could read, they started reading everything: newspapers, pamphlets, even political tracts. And once they could think, well, they began to change the world. By the end of the Victorian era, Britain had transformed. Literacy rates had soared, libraries opened their doors, and education had become a right rather than a privilege. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The kind of progress that starts small, with a slate and a stub of chalk, and ends up reshaping a nation. So as you drift off tonight, picture a Victorian classroom, rows of children in threadbare clothes, heads bent over lessons by candlelight. Imagine the creak of the floorboards, the scrape of chalk, and the hopeful whisper of possibility in the air. Because even in the dullest lesson, the spark of learning was there, waiting to ignite. Chapter 7. Victorian Britain faced health challenges that would make today's flu season look like a gentle tickle. Cities teemed with people, but not with sanitation. Streets were narrow, factories belched smoke, and rivers ran dark with refuse. Disease spread as easily as gossip. Cholera, typhoid, and smallpox were constant companions. Medical knowledge was improving, but slowly. Germ theory was still in its infancy. Doctors didn't wash their hands, surgery was performed with instruments that might have been used on the neighbor's cow that morning. Anesthesia existed, but was new and often feared, and antiseptic practices were considered optional at best. When people fell ill, remedies ranged from harmless to horrifying. Leeches were a favorite. They were supposed to balance humors, a theory that made no modern sense but seemed plausible at the time. Bloodletting, the deliberate draining of patients' blood, was routine. Doctors believed that illness could be cured by removing liquid from the body. The logic: the more dramatic, the more effective. Spoiler alert, not effective. Wealthy patients received attentive care, usually by doctors who had studied at universities and read extensively in Latin. They were prescribed diets, tonics, and gentle exercise. Poor patients, meanwhile, got what they could afford: a stiff drink, a poultice of mysterious herbs, or instructions to rest, assuming they could afford to stop working. Hospitals were a mixture of hope and horror. London, Edinburgh, and other cities boasted large institutions where trained nurses cared for the sick. Florence Nightingale famously transformed nursing, introducing hygiene and order after seeing the chaos of the Crimean War. Before her reforms, hospitals smelled of disinfectant attempts, illness, and occasionally, despair. Mental health was another Victorian adventure in discomfort. Lunatic asylums were grim places, designed more for containment than care. Patients were often treated harshly, subjected to cold baths, restraints, and other procedures that now sound medieval. Families feared these institutions, yet sometimes they were the only place for a loved one who could not manage life on the streets. Child health was a constant concern. Infant mortality was high. Vaccinations were becoming more common, smallpox inoculations saved lives, but superstition and suspicion slowed adoption. Mothers juggled childcare, work, and keeping disease at bay, often with limited knowledge and fewer resources than they needed. Hygiene practices were primitive. Bathing was rare, water was often contaminated, and waste disposal was rudimentary. Urban dwellers sometimes lived above cesspits or in houses without proper plumbing. The stench of the city was inescapable. Cleaning was more ritual than science, and soap was a luxury. Yet, despite the grim statistics, progress quietly advanced. The mid to late 19th century saw the first real understanding of germs, antiseptics, and vaccination programs. Sewage systems improved, public health initiatives began, and hospitals became safer places to be sick. Life expectancy rose, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. Doctors, nurses, and reformers struggled against entrenched ignorance, poverty, and superstition. Public campaigns taught hand-washing, quarantine measures, and nutrition. Charitable institutions provided medicine to the poor. Science gradually triumphed over tradition, although not without resistance, misadventure, and occasional tragedy. And then there were the quacks, medicine men and women who sold miracle cures, snake oils, and tonics guaranteed to cure anything from toothache to melancholy. Some genuinely tried, some took full advantage of desperation. Newspapers carried advertisements promising eternal health for a few shillings. People believed, suffered, and sometimes recovered, but usually just from time and luck. Despite it all, Victorians persevered. They endured cholera outbreaks, epidemics, and surgeries without anesthesia, all while inventing sanitation systems, nursing methods, and medical schools that laid the foundation for the modern NHS. Their world was harsh, but their determination transformed it. Looking back, it's a mixture of horror and admiration. They faced diseases we consider trivial, endured remedies we'd consider medieval, and survived in a society where comfort and care depended entirely on class. And yet, by sheer grit and stubborn curiosity, they built the early framework of modern medicine. So as you rest tonight, grateful for warm beds, running water, and pharmacists who don't carry leeches in their pockets, spare a thought for the Victorians. They fought illness with whatever they had, advanced science against resistance, and somehow survived. And for that, they deserve a quiet nod of respect, and possibly a Victorian-style tonic, if only we dared. Chapter 8. Imagine London in the 1800s, streets teeming with horses, carriages, carts, pedestrians, and the ever-present street vendors. Travel was slow, expensive, and often hazardous. The rich moved elegantly in private carriages with polished wheels and liveried drivers, while the poor trundled along on foot or squeezed into overcrowded omnibuses that rattled like tin boxes on cobblestones. The horse was king. Millions of horses plied the streets, carrying people, goods, and excrement alike. Streets smelled in ways that are impossible to fully appreciate today. Yet horses were indispensable. Without them, commerce would stall, markets would fail, and the mail would remain undelivered. They were the engines of the city, though, like any engine, they required frequent maintenance and cleaning up after. Omnibuses, early buses, if you will, carried multiple passengers along fixed routes. They were a step up from walking, but also a source of jostling, noise, and occasional injury. Imagine being packed in like sardines while the driver cracked his whip and the horses trotted over uneven cobbles. It was not luxurious, but it got people to work, church, or the market. Coaches and stagecoaches were used for longer journeys. They traveled between towns at speeds that seem almost leisurely by modern standards. Comfort was minimal: wooden seats, thin cushions, and frequent stops for horses to rest, drink, and occasionally complain. Passengers endured the sway, bumps, and the occasional dirt thrown up from the road. Yet letters, goods, and people still needed to reach their destinations, and coaches were reliable enough to keep society moving. Then came the railway, the real game changer. Victorian Britain embraced trains like a child discovering chocolate. Steam engines thundered across the countryside, carrying passengers and freight at speeds previously unimaginable. London to Manchester that once took days could now be completed in mere hours. It was loud, smelly, and frightening. Passengers often clutched their hats as locomotives chugged, hissed, and belched smoke like mechanical dragons. Railway stations became hubs of activity. People gathered to watch the engines, vendors sold newspapers and pies, and porters hustled luggage through busy concourses. Timetables began to impose order on the chaos, introducing the concept of railway time, which helped synchronize clocks across the country, a necessity in a world suddenly obsessed with punctuality. For the wealthy, trains were a step down from the luxury of private carriages, but still faster and more convenient. First-class compartments offered plush seats, curtains, and polite conductors. The middle classes embraced second-class carriages, and the poor often squeezed into third-class compartments, where comfort was minimal, air circulation was optional, and travel could be perilous in bad weather. In cities, horse-drawn trams began to appear, precursors to the modern tram system. They offered more organized travel within urban areas, though the streets remained crowded, noisy, and hazardous. Pedestrians had to dodge wheels, hooves, and the occasional runaway horse, all while avoiding puddles, mud, and manure. Transport also revolutionized goods. Coal, textiles, food, and mail could now reach distant cities with unprecedented speed. Local economies expanded, industries grew, and the empire itself relied on the rapid movement of both people and products. Without the railway, Victorian industrialization would have been a very different, much slower affair. Of course, the new speed and power of transport brought new dangers. Accidents were frequent, collisions, derailments, and the occasional runaway carriage were common. Insurance companies thrived. Newspapers loved reporting disasters. Families occasionally wrote letters wondering if a loved one would ever arrive. Travel was exciting, convenient, and terrifying, all at once. And yet, for the first time, ordinary people could travel farther than ever before. Trips to the seaside became possible for the working class. Day excursions, market visits, and even holidays slowly emerged as possibilities. Transport shrank Britain, making cities and towns feel closer, and opening horizons that had once been unimaginable. By the late 19th century, the streets were a mix of horses, omnibuses, trams, and trains, an orchestra of noise and motion. Urban planning began to adapt, engineers experimented with signals, and the first inklings of modern traffic systems appeared. The Victorian obsession with punctuality, speed, and progress drove innovation that shaped the world we live in today. Despite the grime, noise, and occasional trauma of travel, people persevered. Children clutched their hats, mothers held babies close, and men balanced parcels as best they could. Horses grew tired, drivers shouted orders, and the nation moved forward, slowly, steadily, and sometimes in a cloud of coal smoke. So as you settle into your own comfortable transport, perhaps a car, a bus, or even a bicycle, spare a thought for the Victorians. They endured rattling omnibuses, smoky engines, and streets filled with chaos, all to keep Britain moving. And for that, they deserve a quiet nod of admiration. And maybe a mint for surviving the journey. Chapter 9. Think of London, Manchester, or Birmingham in the late 19th century. By night, the streets flickered with gas lamps, the air thick with smoke and anticipation. Crowds moved toward theatres, music halls, and public reading rooms, eager for a few hours of distraction. Entertainment had become a vital part of urban life, a way to escape the relentless grind of work and poverty. Music halls were among the most popular attractions. These venues were lively, often crowded, and filled with an energy that could only come from people desperate to forget factory floors and damp streets for a few hours. Audiences clapped, sang along, and sometimes shouted comments, much like modern comedy shows, only with more waistcoats and fewer microphones. Performances varied. Singers crooned sentimental songs, comedians delivered quick-witted, sometimes bawdy jokes, and dancers twirled across the stage in carefully choreographed displays. Some acts were polished and professional, others were chaotic, improvised, and occasionally disastrous. Yet the audience rarely cared, laughter and applause flowed freely, like a river through the hall. The theatre offered a different, slightly more refined experience. Playwrights like Oscar Wilde and Tom Taylor brought dramas, comedies, and tragedies to the stage. Upper-class Victorians enjoyed velvet seats, private boxes, and the social prestige of attendance, while middle-class citizens treasured a rare opportunity to see a live performance without fear of being trampled. Theatre was an art, music hall was entertainment. Both were essential to Victorian culture. For the working class, penny readings were a lifeline of literacy and amusement. Held in church halls or public rooms, they charged a penny for admission, accessible even to families on tight budgets. Someone would read aloud from a book, poem, or story, while the audience listened, imagined, and sometimes murmured reactions. It was quiet compared to music halls, but no less engaging. These readings helped foster literacy and a love of storytelling, while providing a communal experience in a time before radio or cinema. Street performers added to the mix. Jugglers, puppeteers, magicians, and musicians performed in marketplaces, attracting crowds of children and adults alike. Coins were tossed into hats, Applause erupted spontaneously, and the city buzzed with life. These performers often doubled as social commentators, sneaking jokes about politics, society, and even local scandals into their acts. Entertainment extended to the home as well. Families gathered to play parlor games, tell stories, and sing songs. Musical instruments, such as pianos and violins, were prized possessions, and learning to play one was considered an essential accomplishment, particularly for young ladies of the middle and upper classes. Sheet music flew off the presses, and the sound of amateur recitals echoed through drawing rooms from dusk till bedtime. The circus was another spectacle beloved by Victorians. Traveling circuses brought exotic animals, acrobats, and daring stunts to towns and cities. Children gazed wide-eyed at elephants, lions, and trapeze artists swinging high above the audience. Parents grimaced at the expense but could hardly resist the collective awe and entertainment value. Yet, entertainment was not just about joy. It reflected society's values, anxieties, and hierarchies. Music hall songs often celebrated urban life, mocked politicians, or commented on morality. Theatre explored societal dilemmas, love, and ambition. Even penny readings reinforced literacy and manners. All forms of entertainment carried messages, whether subtle or overt, shaping public perception alongside amusement. By the late 19th century, the advent of photography, illustrated magazines, and eventually moving pictures began to supplement traditional forms of amusement. But music halls, theatres, and readings remained central to daily life, crucial escapes from work, poverty, and the relentless march of industry. For a few hours, Victorians could laugh, gasp, or marvel at talent, and forget the soot that clung to their boots. The energy, noise, and enthusiasm of Victorian entertainment were contagious. Audiences were rarely passive, participation was part of the fun. People clapped, sang, and shouted their approval, creating an atmosphere of community. In a society often rigidly divided by class, these shared experiences offered rare moments of collective joy. Looking back, it's charming, chaotic, and slightly exhausting. Imagine the cacophony of music, laughter, applause, and street noise, all layered over the smell of coal, food, and perfume. Yet, amid the chaos, creativity thrived. People adapted, improvised, and celebrated life, despite the hardships surrounding them. So as you relax tonight, perhaps with a cup of tea or a small snack, picture a Victorian music hall or theatre, the flicker of gas lamps, the shuffle of boots on wooden floors, the gleam of a performer's costume, and the sound of applause rippling through the crowd. It was noisy, unpredictable, and wonderfully human. Chapter 10. For most working-class Victorians, holidays were brief, rare, and often simple. Paid time off didn't exist as we know it. A factory worker or servant might get a day or two to rest, attend a fair, or travel to a nearby seaside town if they were lucky. Yet, even limited leisure was cherished, a tiny oasis in a world of long hours and grime. Seaside trips became increasingly popular in the mid to late 19th century. Railways had made distant towns accessible, so families could leave crowded cities for fresh air, sand, and a sense of adventure. Places like Brighton, Blackpool, and Scarborough buzzed with visitors, bringing new energy to coastal towns. Children ran across beaches, collected shells, and braved chilly waters, while parents tried to keep clothes, lunches, and temperaments intact. Seaside resorts were a curious mixture of elegance and chaos. Promenades teemed with visitors in their Sunday best attire, bonnets, jackets, and sometimes multiple layers of petticoats. Punch and Judy shows entertained children, while adults wandered piers, watched performances, or simply enjoyed the view. Deck chairs became the furniture of choice for contemplation, gossip, or napping in the sun, a new invention that would delight generations. Picnics were another favorite pastime. In city parks or countryside glades, families spread blankets and unpacked baskets of bread, cheese, cold meat, and fruit. Tea was essential. A Victorian picnic might also include games like hoops, skipping ropes, or ball tossing. For the middle class, it was an opportunity to display manners and social graces. For children, it was sheer freedom, running barefoot, playing tag, and occasionally sneaking a second slice of cake. Seasonal fairs brought towns together with a carnival of lights, music, and vendors. Temporary stalls sold sweets, toys, and trinkets. Organ grinders played, performers danced, and acrobats thrilled crowds. For one day, the rigid structures of daily life melted into a whirlwind of laughter, noise, and bright colors. Fairs were also an opportunity to gossip, admire fashion, and indulge in the odd harmless thrill, or sugar rush. Sporting events provided another escape. Cricket matches, horse races, and foot races were popular across classes. Betting, cheering, and communal excitement created bonds, while players and spectators alike embraced the rare joy of competition. For many, attending or participating in sport was a brief release from the monotony of work, offering both amusement and a sense of pride. For wealthier Victorians, leisure extended to country houses, hunting, boating, and theatre outings. Their holidays were carefully orchestrated, with itineraries, carriages, and proper attire. Yet even here, the goal was simple: relaxation, enjoyment, and perhaps the gentle reinforcement of social status. Observing nature, playing music, or hosting picnics were as much about leisure as about demonstrating refinement. Public parks and gardens, increasingly common in cities, also became spaces for leisure. Families strolled along pathways, children played on swings, and couples promenaded in the afternoon sun. For urban dwellers, parks offered a rare taste of greenery, fresh air, and a brief escape from smoke, cobblestones, and the constant clatter of industry. Leisure in Victorian Britain was more than amusement. It reinforced community, family bonds, and social cohesion. Fairs, picnics, and seaside trips allowed people to step outside their routines, experience novelty, and create memories, a counterpoint to the hard, relentless pace of everyday life. These moments were small, precious, and often fleeting, yet they shaped the rhythm of society. Despite the occasional mud, cold wind, or sunburn, Victorians embraced leisure with enthusiasm. They adapted to limitations, celebrated ingenuity, and found joy wherever possible. Their holidays were modest by today's standards, yet rich in laughter, interaction, and shared experience. So as you relax tonight, imagine a Victorian family on the beach, children running along the tide, mothers fussing over bonnets, fathers reading newspapers or dozing in deck chairs. Picture a fair with spinning wheels, candy stalls, and the occasional shilling lost to a game of chance. These were the small escapes that brightened the lives of ordinary people, moments of light amid smoke, soot, and labor. I'm Stella, and this has been Sleepy, Boring, and Historic. May your leisure be sweet, your picnics plentiful, and your seaside trips pleasantly devoid of coal smoke.